Welcome back, everyone. Hopefully that was a long enough break to do whatever you need to do, grab some snacks, etc. This is a lichen marathon, not a sprint. So we're going to jump into module 4, which is getting to know some local lichens. Now, I want to say I appreciate that folks are joining us from all over, which is so exciting and thrilling. So when I say local lichens, I am going to be focusing on California lichens, but some of the ones I will introduce to you are actually urban lichens, and so they very well could be wherever you are as well. So let's jump right in. Duh, I just said that, okay. Common lichens in urban and suburban areas with a particular focus on California. All right, our very first contender is Xanthoria parietina, or the maritime sunburst lichen. I enjoy including the common names because we lichenologists come up with a lot of really fun common names for these, and actually other people do too, which in fact has led to something that doesn't just happen with lichens, but happens with many things, in that there's no consensus on common names, but there's a little bit, especially when you get to the genus level. So Xanthorias are generally called the sunburst lichens. And if you look at them, or another Xanthoria species, Xanthoria elegans, which is a much deeper orange and grows on rocks, it looks like a little sunburst, so it's very apropos. So back to our Xanthoria parietina. This is a folio species, so reviewing some of our terms. It's generally epiphytic, meaning it grows on the bark of trees, but it can grow on other substrates as well. One of the things that has made this particular species rather cosmopolitan is that it can grow in a variety of conditions and on a variety of substrates. And one of the reasons for this is that it is very stress tolerant. So it is in fact nitrophilic, but it can deal with heavy air pollution, and it can also deal with a range of light conditions from quite shaded to quite sunny. And within that range of light, Xanthoria can appear almost green to yellow to actually quite orange. And the reason for that is this parietin, which it uses to help protect it from that intense sunlight. And that parietin actually fluoresces in UV. So this is my terrible cell phone picture example of some of this fluorescence that I was talking about in one of the previous modules. So in normal light, the Xanthoria is yellow, and then shining on UV, it's UV plus orange. So again, in a key, that would be something that you would look for. So, like I said, it's a relatively cosmopolitan species, meaning you can find it almost all over the world, not quite, but it's quite widespread. It is mostly in urban, suburban, and then forested environments, with somewhat of a coastal preference, but everywhere that it's found, it's moving further inland. And in the United States, it actually used to be quite rare on the West Coast, and now we're finding more and more of it. What's leading to this spread, we don't quite know, but given that it is quite stress tolerant and quite well adapted to these urban and suburban environments, it could simply be tracking human development. And so that's a possibility. So that's our Xanthoria. Our next one is another quite common urban and suburban species. It is also quite stress and pollution tolerant, but not quite as much as Xanthoria parietina. So you'll generally, you can find these growing together, but generally you'll find them in slightly different sort of patches along the urban to suburban to natural gradient. So this is Flavoparmelia caperata. This is the common green shield. And of course, the reason for that common name is they often grow in these very nicely rounded shapes. So they look very much like green shields on the sides of trees. There are a few other lichens, of course, that have a similar shape, but and color. But Flavoparmelia caperata really stands out. And part of that is it's more of this yellowy green color, as opposed to more of a gray-green or green-green, as some of the other ones are. This is that thing in the keys that I was talking about. Good luck trying to figure out whether something is gray, green, yellow, green, green, or whatever the other things that we lichenologists have come up with to distinguish various shades of green. But anyway, you get an eye for it over time. And you can see it's even standing out against some of these other lichens that are growing close by, which I would say are more gray-green. This is another foliose, so it's quite flat against the substrate, but you can still see that it's more three-dimensional than a crust, and it's leafy, and it's got these lobes. And it is also epiphytic. From what I've observed, it's totally epiphytic. It's very rare to find it on other substrates, but probably not impossible. And again, it's one of the most common foliose lichens you'll encounter in urban and suburban environments. There are some others, like some Physia species, for example, that the Physia will grow actually right alongside the Xanthoria. But in terms of this like sort of big, bright green thing, Flavoparmelia is your lichen. It reproduces via soredia. So you'd want to take a close look at this and look for some sort of, powderiness, either on the surface or along the edges. It can form apothecia, but they are super rare. And generally you'll see apothecia forming in a slightly a less developed environment. So for the most part, they reproduce via soredia. And of course, you can imagine in what we might consider to be a stressful environment, like an urban or suburban landscape, taking everything you need with you is a good strategy. This is another one that you've probably seen. This is Chrysothrix xanthina, the gold dust lichen. So in this picture, it looks very greenish, but it can look, again, it can range kind of from this green to bright yellow or golden. And it can form quite large patches on the sides of trees. So again, it's epiphytic, but it can also be quite sporadically spread out as well. And it is, again, if your key or guide only has crustose, foliose, or fruticose, this would be a crustose, but it's actually more of that leprose structure that I introduced briefly in the other module. Other than the fact that this is a common one to encounter in these landscapes, I included it because many of the lichens that we've discussed today are in that group Lichenoromycetes, but this is in a totally different group. It's in the order Arthoniales. So that it's like, I may be small, but I'm totally different from these other guys, so pay attention. And yes, so very common on city and park trees. This is, I've probably said this for several lichens already, but this is one of my particular favorites. And that's because I encountered it in my own back deck after a rain. So, and it was actually my housemate who did. So, rain is relatively rare in California. So I moved in when it was very dry, didn't notice anything amiss with the railing of my deck. And then some good rains came, and my housemate was like, look at all those green patches on the railing of the deck out there. Like, what's going on? Turns out it was this lichen, and it's actually called the board lichen, Trapeliopsis flexuosa. So I included both a dry and a wet picture here, and that's again to emphasize that idea that these things look very different, dry versus wet. So dry, it's almost invisible. It looks practically the same as the board, and it's, especially if it's an old, wooden railing like mine is on my deck, then you would just think that's the texture of the wood, the weathered wood. But then the rains come, the lichen gets all happy and green, and photosynthesis is happening, and you're like, wow, look at all this texture. This thing is alive. It's Trapeliopsis flexuosa. So again, in terms of reviewing our lichen terms and traits, this is a crustose species, very flat against the substrate. It would be, depending on what key you're using, either warty or areolate. So that's that term I introduced earlier. So it grows on exposed wood. So of course it can be found in forest environments, but it would be on that exposed old wood as opposed to just on the bark. And in developed environments like ours, this includes fences and decks. So definitely if you have a wooden deck, especially an older one, go out after rain and take a look, and you might be surprised to find that you are very close neighbors with the board lichen. So definitely one of my personal favorites. Another really fantastic just genus is Hypogymnia. The common name for the whole genus, the whole group, is the tube lichens, but Hypogymnia imshaugii is the forked tube lichen. This is another epiphytic species, so this grows on trees, but actually more so on the branches and twigs rather than the trunks of trees. And it has, this is one of those really fun, confusing ones, because look how three-dimensional it is, but this is a foliose lichen. Why? Because it has a very distinctive upper and lower surface. This upper surface is green, as you can see here, and then the lower surface gradates from black to brown. And if you were to take a cross-section of this, the algal layer would just be under that upper cortex and not on the bottom. What makes Hypogymnia really distinctive as a group is it has inflated lobes. And this is so much fun. Go forth and find a Hypogymnia, especially, again, if it's not totally dry, but just slightly moist. And you can kind of squish the lobes and they'll bounce back because they have air inside. And then there's a whole bunch of, once you get into the Hypogymnia key, there's a whole bunch of things about whether once you cut inside that inflated lobe, how much airspace is there, is the medullary tissue brown or white, et cetera, et cetera. But again, a really, really fun group to encounter and actually to play with a little bit because they are kind of squishy. These are not going to be in the middle of the city. If they are, hot diggity dog, you live in a really clean city in terms of air quality. But for the most part, if you are able to get into a park or a forest just outside the urban and suburban landscape, that's where you're going to encounter your Hypogymnias. And then again, it totally depends on where you are, but around here, you'll certainly encounter a lot of them. So on Mount Tam, for example, there's a ton of Hypogymnias to be found, but in plenty of other natural spaces as well. And yes, so because of their very three-dimensional, both in terms of the inflated lobes, but actually in terms of sort of raising themselves like well above the substrate, they can dominate some branch lichen communities. Like I said, it's that competition for space, but primarily for light, and they are very successful at that. So that's another really cool thing about Hypogymnias. This is just one species of Hypogymnia, Hypogymnia imshaugii. There are some that have much broader lobes, but again, still inflated. There are some that have much narrower lobes and like just really long green fingers. It looks super cool. So definitely, I encourage you to go forth and explore and find as many Hypogymnias as you can. It will depend on where you live. South Florida, for example, I wouldn't encounter too many of these per se, but yeah, depends on where you are. I had to include this one because it's red, and red is so rare in the lichens that I get excited every time. Every time there's one. I mean, this looks pretty orangey, but anytime they hint at red. So this is Usnea rubicunda, the red beard lichen. So yes, so a lot of lichens that are hanging from the trees are either, actually, there's a lot of different genera. I was going to say they're either Usneas or Ramalinas. False. There's also Bryoria, Alectoria. We could do a whole session just on pendulous lichens. In fact, that's a good idea. We should do that. But Usnea rubicunda, the red beard lichen, it's fruticose. So we now have this three-dimensional bushy lichen that is basically the same on all sides. And if you were to do that cross-section, you'd have those same layers on all sides rather than a particular upper and lower. It's also epiphytic, and again, it also seems to prefer the branches and twigs as opposed to the main trunk. It has this distinctive rust orange to red color, which distinguishes it from other Usnea species that you could encounter, again, specifically out here in California. And it often grows, as in this picture, alongside other Usnea species. And so it's really fun to find because Usneas are notoriously difficult to identify, but this one stands out. So it's like, yay, I know who that one is. And again, like the Hypogymnias, it's found more in natural areas just outside of cities, as opposed to it can't tolerate the intense disturbance and potential air pollution of the city itself. I don't think I'm going to get to this later, so it's worth mentioning now. One really, so Hypogymnias, the whole group has that distinction of the inflated lobes. Usneas, basically the whole group has a distinguishing feature, and that is on the very inside of each of those branches, it has what's called a central cord. So again, if this lichen is slightly moist, if you're trying to identify or like make sure that it's an Usnea, you can just gently start pulling the branch away from itself, and you should see usually a white central cord that's not breaking as easily as the rest of it. And it'll have this, again, when wet, not when dry. When dry, it'll just break. It'll have this kind of elasticy quality, and that is a distinguishing feature of most Usnea species. So that can, if you're debating between, say, an Usnea and an Alectoria or an Usnea and a Ramalina, look for that central cord. Yes, okay. So we've talked mostly about epiphytic species, so I thought it was really important to include some species that grow on other substrates. This is Xanthoparmelia lineola, the tight rock shield. There are multiple Xanthoparmelia species here in California, and there are multiple ones that can sort of toe the line of this, urban, suburban, natural area gradient. So this is just one example. They are kind of like the Flavoparmelia in that they can tend to be more yellow-green as opposed to gray-green, but again, there's variability within that. They're foliose, but they are very tightly pressed to the substrate. So again, you're looking for these lobes as a feature, and also it would be a little difficult to pry up to look at the underside, but a distinctive upper and lower surface. And again, you won't find these. Actually, I have seen some around Berkeley, the city of Berkeley, but generally you'll find these more in the suburban to montane as opposed to city center. But give them a rock and a good microclimate, and you'll probably find some Xanthoparmelia there. This was in the introductory slides as well at the very beginning of this workshop, but I cannot not include Ramalina menziesii, the lace lichen. As Stacy mentioned, it is just absolutely distinctive in morphology from anything else in North America, and it is gorgeous. It's just a beautiful lichen. It is fruticose, and also, within that hanging down, it's pendulose. It has a coastal distribution, and its net-like structure is really well suited to capturing moisture from fog. And so it is very dependent on that marine layer that comes in. And this is California's state lichen. California is currently the only state that has a state lichen. Go California. And they could not have made a better choice. It's found throughout California, again, closer to the coast. And it's just a really, really distinctive and beautiful lichen. And also, as Stacy mentioned, it's important for a lot of the wildlife here as well. It's a food source and a habitat source, and I'll get more into that in one of the next sections. So that was just a really quick intro to some lichens that you can encounter in urban and suburban environments, but again, with a focus particularly on California, and even within that, with a focus on the Bay Area, as that is where I am speaking to you from. But hopefully that gives you some things to look for and hopefully identify wherever you are. So now I will take any questions.